At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity.
Number 5, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out. Those 1 a.m. selfies never looked or felt so good. Ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was quite common, but they didn't have any neon lights or quotes and selfies. It was just a lot of bricks. Oh, and also, it smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, of course, they also had to share. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal. You would spend hours here and you got done, literally. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, all the while a dude's in the corner just like going to the bathroom. Romans believed the goddess Cloacina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Cloaca Maxima translates to big drain. I guess when you invent the flushing toilet, you can call them whatever you want. Just don't call any meetings there, perhaps. Might be a good start. Number 4, no soap. Sometimes you're in a rush, it happens. You don't have time to shower, so you do the classic spray yourself with cologne and then hope that you fool the world. It's a smart move, but the ancient Romans were way ahead of you. While they didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent, it's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. Instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz, but later on, once that oil had dried up, it was then removed with a wooden wedge or a spatula-like tool called a striggle. The world's most painful loofah, sign me up. Dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently just peeled off. So it did work, but it took a little more time than our usual showers nowadays, our 5-minute rushes before work. For Romans who were well off, this was a whole event. There were several assistants you could pick from all these fancy and fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. How was anybody ever on time back then? Number 3, all the poison. There's always the one kid who's allergic to nuts on your flight. And it's horrible, now nobody gets nuts on this flight. It's tragic, really. Research shows that feeding infants peanuts or peanut products when they're around 4 to 6 months old can prevent a peanut allergy. But Roman emperors had their own way of achieving immunity. It was common for Roman kings to seek out and then consume a small amount of each known poison because they thought at the end of this grueling trial you would become immune to them all. It was a hot blend called Mithridatum, named of course after the poison's creator, Mithridates the Great. He lived until he was 80, so maybe these potions that he created might have actually worked. The world's first vaccine perhaps. Number 2, thumbs up or thumbs down. Giving somebody a thumbs up after they've done something, it feels nice. You're like, yeah. Even a sarcastic thumbs up, use those when you get cut off in traffic. In the hit film Gladiator, there's a scene where Joaquin Phoenix's character gives Russell Crowe's character a thumbs up, and in turn he lives, and then we watch cinematic redemption. In real life, ancient Romans used these thumb signs to determine a gladiator's fate in the Colosseum. It was referred to as pollice verso. It's the Latin term for a turned thumb. The crowd would vote if a gladiator should die or not, which is also insane. It's like America's Got Talent, but like insane. While it's nice to receive a thumbs up after doing something today, if you got a thumbs up or even a thumbs down, it meant your days of living have come to an end. And finally, number 1, animals in the arena. In order to spice up the classic fight and clashing swords till death action, sometimes gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. Were they squirrels, maybe an opossum, or were they tigers or elephants, bears, lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves? Oh my god, they didn't win these often, did they? Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used all the time, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights if they did include them. Like Logan Paul vs. Mayweather, it's a big social event. Most animals who were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part as well. I'm a big animal lover, so much so that I'm rooting for the elephants in these fights while reading up about this. This led to another important factor down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals started taking place. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile and made them extinct. Now cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct.
Number 10, grid-based cities. Next time you find yourself at 2nd Avenue and East 59th Street in New York and get into a car accident or are just enjoying the pleasures of Manhattan traffic, you can thank the Romans. Also, shout out to New York. Chetty loves you. What's going on, New York? How you doing? How you doing? No, how you doing? Yes, it was the Romans who began to develop cities and Rome into a grid-like pattern. In a time before roads full of cars, this makes sense. I mean, come on, how much space and traffic can horses and carriages take up? There are benefits to building your city in a grid pattern. It's walkable, easy to navigate, and you can size up the city pretty well. I play a lot of city builders. I like those games. Those games are fun. SimCity. Trust me, I would know. This is also true so long as your city isn't packed with skyscrapers and bumper-to-bumper in rideshare vehicles. You kind of lose the plot when you get to a big city like that, but they started it, they're the ones. Number 9, arches. For the dudes who like feet, this one is not for you. Ain't those kind of arches, dude, sorry. Today I'm talking about Roman arches. Someone somewhere in Rome discovered that the shape of an arch actually makes for a very effective building. I know, who would have thought? You can tell because as soon as they were discovered, they were popping up everywhere, like pimples on prom night. Simple geometry makes complex architecture. Arches can handle their loads, even if they are overbearing. And trust me, I've seen some overbearing loads in my lifetime. Where's an arch when you need one? The arch simply is a mainstay of Roman architecture and a small part of what made up of the magnificent constructions. I'll get more to that on later. You'll see. Number 8. Sewers and sanitation. Apart from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, roads, and the fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? Man, I love that quote. Both historical and comical. It's kind of like, I think that's why you guys like to watch me sometimes, right? We'll try it. We'll see. Best of both worlds. Well, it's true. The Romans understood how important sanitation was. While perhaps not the first invention of such, they are the inventors of the modern use of such. The Mediterranean is gorgeous, but after a diet of fish from the sea and pasta, well, you gotta go. One of the ways Romans did this was public bathrooms, except it's more like a room where you and the whole city just do what must be done in front of one another. There's no stalls, it's kind of just lined up. It's a little gross, a little bit. So yes, the sanitation was a great thing, but going together all at once? Well, I don't have to tell you how bad that was. Especially, public washrooms, how they can be bad. Especially with open stalls. That just can't, no good. Number 7, roads. All roads lead to Rome. This might sound very stupid, but to us, the Roman roads did change history. Given that there's still Roman roads out there right now that have survived 2,000 years of climate and use, it's pretty impressive. And then there's our modern roads that give in after a couple bad winters in your grandfather's boat of a Buick, creating potholes every time he brakes. The roads consisted of layers of rock and dirt that made for a sturdy road. Hundreds of civilians, horses, traders, carts traveling back and forth on Roman roads every day. Imagine how hard it would be to get to the next city over with no car and no road. That's some rough traveling. Too bad we couldn't have them back or build our roads today. I've got some denarius for the next Roman to build me a road, baby. Come on over, build us a road. Number 6, aqueducts. These are honestly amazing feats of engineering. Even today, it's a lot of bricks to lay down for a little bit of water. So the question is, you build a very busy city, probably the most impressive city and cities of the ancient era. You need 2 things for all those folks, water and food. Okay, well, we can do farms outside the city walls, no problem, but water, we need people to drink water, and those farms need water too. How do you get water to a busy city center? Aqueducts. Basically, a long bridge that connects freshwater springs to the fountains in the city. Essentially, running water. This, for the time, was very incredible. Hundreds, if not thousands of years ahead of their time. To be able to walk into town and drink fresh water was a luxury, one that Rome might have taken for granted. Now every home has running water, and it's great and we all love it. You love tap water, I love tap water. Where's my Brita? Number 5, collars. Collars were made for animals, dogs, cattle. No one likes wearing them. Well, maybe except a certain anthropomorphic community, that is. You know what I'm talking about. Sadly though, Roman slaves did wear collars, similar to dog tags in the military. It's a form of identification, and you know that said person is a slave, which in case you didn't know was super uncool. Anyone who says otherwise is just off, or if I had to take a guess, they're the same people who would choose to side with Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas. You know gosh darn well that the NCR is the right choice, and or also leading the Las Vegas Strip by yourself. I mean, come on, who doesn't want to be the CEO of 3 luxurious casinos in the Mojave Wasteland? But I digress. The collars are naughty. They're bad. Don't do that. Especially the explosive ones. I don't like it. Number 4, currency. There's something that just tickles my fancy when thinking about Roman gold coins. Maybe it's my inner historian, or maybe it's because my persona is Wario. Wario likes gold. Can't blame me. However, the Roman denarius is not what we're talking about right now. I'm talking about the ancients' other favorite currency, flesh and bone. Unfortunately for the slaves of Rome, they were traded, bought, and sold like an item, or used as a currency. When you build a whole society around such a horrible thing, this just kind of makes sense. It adds up. To make bad things even worse, sometimes when Rome was expanding or the Gauls got a little too close to Rome and some borders were being exchanged, it often meant that some slaves would change hands too. And by that, I mean they were taken and put to work for another boss that was probably less nice to them since they didn't come from the same area. Boy, history sure is mean sometimes, I tell you, that history, oh boy! Number 3, the bathhouse. I didn't think this was going to be a secret to anyone, but the slaves weren't just working in the fields or putting up some arches that last longer than most marriages. No, some poor folks had the duty of polishing pearls, smoking the salami, waxing the carrot, and finger fishing for clams. I think you get my point. Yes, the oldest profession in the world, however, it wasn't exactly a profession in this case, more like It had to be done or there would be consequences. Eugh. For me, brothels might sound great on paper, but when you're laying down in the doctor's office and he's trying to scrape barnacles off your piece of deal, well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Number 2, gladiators. Guys, I actually learned something today. I know, right? Imagine little old me learning something. Gladiators, you know them, you love them. The movie is okay in my opinion. The warriors who duked it out in the Roman Colosseum weren't always brought in chains. Some were volunteers actually. Honestly, as I was writing this, I thought to myself, well, gosh darn it there, feller. If that don't sound like that's the Hunger Games. That's right, being dragged away from your family and forced to fight in blood sport. All you're missing is Donald Sutherland's buttery smooth voice. I also can't help myself in mentioning this, but probably the first battle royale ever too. So maybe it's just a part of us. Something about the last man standing that we love so much, and why I want to spend all my savings on Fortnite skins. Number 1, thumbs up, very nice. Listen, we've all seen the movie. Joaquin Phoenix is standing there looking all Roman-like and looking into the heart of Russell Crowe, knowing damn well this will probably be his last blockbuster. That's just how it goes. There in suspense, the audience waits to see what his thumbs do to decide his fate. Well, this is true of the Roman slaves in the Colosseum, however, there's a couple things that differ from the movie. 1, being not all who went into battle perished, and 2, the thumbs down might be what you want, actually, not the thumbs up. Meaning that the thumbs up meant yes, go ahead and finish the plebeian. A thumbs down, a fist, or even waving a cloth might have meant no, spare the poor soul, have mercy. All I know is that I do not volunteer as tribute. Sorry, Prim.
Number 10, parties of poison. Hindsight is 2020, which I find more ironic than ever since the whole thing that happened and is continuing to happen. Today we know that lead, especially in large doses, is not good. It's poison. But a lot of the pipes that the Romans used in their plumbing were made from lead. Their water had 100 times more lead in it than the water that came from the springs, which means every time they drank water, they were poisoning themselves. Some side effects include behavioral changes as well as weakening organs and vital signs, etc., which may explain some of the more questionable emperor behaviors or the fall of the Roman Empire, because people got nuts. But to add insult to injury, the Romans used to sweeten their wine with something called sapa. Sapa is lead acetate, the sugar of lead, and it's also a salt, which is confusing, and therefore poison. Since Romans could down as much as 2 liters of wine in one sitting, they were slowly poisoning themselves, first with water, then with the wine. Speaking of wine, moving on to number 9, we have you better love wine. If you're a vodka or a beer person, you might not fit in while partying with the Romans, especially if you hate wine. Wine was the lifeblood of ancient Roman parties. Wine was drunk at every stage of the Roman party, but it had to be diluted with hot or cold water. Unlike how we drink wine today, which would be crazy if you were to dilute it. Whoa. It was looked down upon to drink wine in its purest form. It was served out with ladles, usually by naked and attractive male slaves. To heat the water, the Romans used special boilers, but if you really wanted to be bougie, they would add snow to make it cold. Considering they didn't have fridges back then, imagine the lengths they would have to go to keep the snow cold. Beyond temperature, Romans absolutely drooled for calda and mulsum. Calda was great for cold nights. It was kind of like a mulled wine. It was served hot and infused with spices. Mulda was infused with honey and a lot sweeter. I want to try and make both. Maybe I will on my Instagram. Let me know if I should in the comments below. Minus the lead, of course. Number 8, seating charts. If you have ever been involved in a wedding, you know how important a seating chart is. Or like even in school, when you're like assigned desks, it's a big deal. You could end up sitting next to your uncomfortable cousin or beside your smelly Aunt Sue. It could determine whether the conversation flows or it's stagnant the entire night. Ugh, hate that. Romans understood the matchmaking game when it came to banquets. It was a pretty big deal. Where you sat determined your station and overall how liked you were. They had a 3-couch system called the triclinium. The most honored guests would sit on the couch in the center next to the hosts on the right. But if you were on the couch on the left, it kinda meant that you weren't as big of a deal. Sorry. Eventually, as parties got bigger, so did the 3-couch rule extend to a huge semicircular couch in the middle that could hold about 12 people. Number 7, gladiator fights. We just did a video on this, Taylor and I, go check it out. Now, parties weren't just about eating, drinking, and socializing, there had to be entertainment, of course. Roman parties were designed around the five senses: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. So of course there were the ancient Roman bards jamming out some earworms, but what was there to look at? You could only watch someone play the harp for so long. Next up on the entertainment list was acrobats, dancing girls, even mimes, which I was surprised to learn, plus trained exotic animals. If you were more like the charcuterie and like a quiet evening kind of person, you might enjoy poetry readings. But what really got the party started was an epic gladiatorial battle. Nothing like putting sharp objects in drunk people's hands. But that wasn't all they did. Parties were a big deal and nobles loved to outdo each other, so sometimes they went too far. More than once it got out of hand, but the most famous was during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus. He wanted to shower his dinner guests with flowers, so he built a false ceiling filled with them, but the flowers somehow ended up smothering some of his guests to death because he just kind of went overboard. Death by Roses. That's a poem title right there. Stick to poetry nights, my friends. Number 6, Saturnalia. One of the most popular Roman festivals. It was kind of like an early Christmas celebration, kind of, except it wasn't at all. It was actually about the god Saturn, not Christ. Oops, but it did take place in December 17th to be precise, for 3 days. But people loved it so much, it soon got extended to 7, a whole week. All work and businesses were suspended, so better do your shopping on the 16th. Slaves were even temporarily free to do as they pleased, even moral restrictions were eased. A mock king was chosen, and candles, wax fruit, wax statues were all given as presents. The practice of candle giving was to symbolize the sun returning after the winter solstice. A statue of Saturn bound at the feet would be untied and invited to join the party. The houses were adorned with wreaths and greenery, kinda like Christmas, and singing, dancing, gambling were all common features, so kind of like Mardi Gras and Christmas combined.
Number 5, Blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andabata, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious? They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape!
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or 2. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets. Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus. Place your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes. And then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
Number 2, are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah. Take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're good to go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, naval battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or two. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. You can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice. Nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying.
Number 10. The blade, the wife, and the horse? If you love something, you gotta let it go. Or how about parading your naked wife in front of your friends in the mighty Roman military? Emperor Caligula was so impressed with his wife's beauty, he just thought he had to share it, even though apparently she wasn't that attractive, and already had children with another man. Scandalous. If she had wheels, she'd be the town bike, if you know what I'm saying. As if displaying your wife's gratuitous curves isn't scandalous enough, apparently he would use very real threats as a strange way of flirting. Clearly this was a dude who's got some issues. Like for example, the one time he wanted to humiliate the Roman Senate by claiming to make his horse a consul. Although he didn't actually go through with it. Still though, this one's all 6s and 9s, innit? This may have been related to a brothel caught disease. He might have had syphilis, I'm just saying. Number 9, no grain. Maximus Thrax was like most Roman emperors. Seized power when he wanted, seized land when he wanted, pretty much did whatever he wanted. Strangely enough, however, he cut subsidies for grain. This was one of the many tactics to help up cover for increased taxes. Taxes that were imposed because he had doubled the pay of the military during constant military action. That's a lot of coins needed. Eventually the people had had enough. And ironically, his own guards poked him with spears until he couldn't be poked anymore. I'm not a military expert or anything, but if you're gonna wage war, you gotta have the money for it. It's kind of like when the ice cream truck comes around and you're counting quarters for a large chocolate cone because you're 12 and life is hard and you deserve it. I love the ice cream truck. Number 8, Red Roman. Emperor Caracalla was also like many other Roman emperors, as he was quite bloodthirsty, and honestly just a bad dude. He unalived his brother Gaeta just because he didn't like him. Good reason, I guess. Then 20,000 of his brother's followers persecuted and killed. When some good folks heard about this terrible news, and were horrified, rightfully so, I mean who wouldn't be, they too were dealt with in a non-YouTube conduct safe way. He depleted the treasury from war and let foreigners have Roman citizenship. Now I know that sounds like a good thing, but it isn't. In already trying times, it completely messed up Roman societal culture. In a sense, fire is good. It allows us many things, but Caracalla threw a whole jerry can of gasoline on the fire by doing that. When your society is built on one thing, perhaps it's a good idea to not totally flip that upside down overnight, as quick decisions like that lead to quick downfalls. Just saying though, just saying. Number 7. The light of my life. Emperor Nero was straight up just not a cool guy. This whole list could be about him, but I'm here to make you laugh, not horrify you with the horrors of Pax Romana. Nero, like most emperors, was very wealthy, the kind of wealth that only people who shop at Whole Foods can understand. As it turns out, there was a fire in Rome at the time. Burned for a long time, pretty big deal. Who started the fire? No one really knows, even though Nero himself might be a suspect. However, it would be really easy to get rid of a group of people you don't like if you blame it on them. So it was blamed on the hot new religion at the time. You gotta love them, Christians, except Nero didn't, and he was kind of egotistical, so in order to punish these scapegoated Christians, he had them set ablaze. So there was more light in his garden, so to speak, or that's what is said, at least. I know sometimes we can all disagree with our faith, but lighting each other on fire is not the answer. Mom always said if you have nothing nice to say, then don't light people on fire. Okay, Mom. Number 6. Not so Hercules. Commodus was like many other emperors in thinking that he was very close to the gods, but Commodus thought he was a Greek god, and reincarnated Hercules to be exact. So much so that he would often take up a role as a gladiator, which a lot of Romans thought was scandalous as a leader. A leader shouldn't be dealing with the barbarians at our gates and other lands that were persecuting and invading and taking over, rather than performing in blood sports. It was thought that this was below the office of the emperor. Rumors began to stir that because of his love for the arena, he may not be the royal bloodline claimed to be. When in the arena, his adversaries always surrendered, so he always won. In return, he wouldn't kill them, to be fair, just scarred them, as it was seen to be a good thing to be bested by the emperor and then to leave with a mark. Sure, we'll go with that. Apparently, they also brought animals in for him to slaughter in the arena for entertainment. Eventually, people had enough of him wasting time and money playing gladiator games, and he was strangled by his coach. Oh, hey coach, I'm ready for the next match. How you doing? Hey, why are you looking at me like that, man? What's wrong? And what's that rope for?
I hope you're curious because the next is Trial of Curious. In 63 BCE, a trial took place in ancient Rome, which is still shrouded in mystery, even in its own time. And it serves as a reminder why the statute of limitations is in place, because Romans really charged a dude for a 37-year-old crime and Prochillo, aka the super duper high treason. Saturnius works with Gaius Marius a lot. His support helps Marius in winning 7 consulships and securing land for veterans. Things go south though when Saturnius and another friend, Glaucia, are implied for 2 political slayings and put out a bill saying the lands they owned would be redistributed to the poor. When have rich people ever liked that news? So he put in the bill, if you fight against that, you lose your royal status. When representatives of the Senate came to Marius asking for his help, Marius, even in Plutarch's version, actually feigned a bad case of diarrhea to avoid having to deal with this. In the end, Saturnus and Glaucia are overpowered, forced to surrender, and stoned to death. Marius sadly has to abandon his buddy and moves on in his life for 37 years. One of the instigators against Marius can be identified with certainty. His name was Titus, again, and he must have been in his mid-30s during the trial but wasn't born when the stoning even went down. But he knew his uncle was one of the victims and felt that was a pretty good way to get some fame and cash. They could have gone after a bunch of other options but Marius, someone who was friends with the victim, and weirdly he was their unspecified choice. He was charged with complicity, which he obviously denied, but where the hell was he gonna find witnesses 37 years later when most people died in this time at like 20? Thus, the insane charge of high treason as well as the killings. Cesario, who acted as his defense, had done what he could, but he was no match for the bratty nepotism of Roman hierarchy, so Marius was crucified. Speak with your chest, baby girl, it's Marcia of Sentinum. There's lots of notable women lost to history thanks to sexism, but some remain on the blurred line. We know little about her. Her native city is an ancient Umbrian town, and her vague description is dark hair. The only Latin author that wrote of her is Valerius Maximus, and it's in his Memorable Deeds and Sayings text. He paid more attention to the action done by this woman because it isn't in compliance with the social and cultural values of ancient Rome. Masseria is one of those women who, as Valerius writes, were restrained from speaking in the forum and in the courts either by their sex or by the chastity of matronly dress. The men of Masseria's family were involved in the Great Umbrian Revolt of 90. For this reason, they couldn't defend her in court when she was put there in charges. We're not really sure what those charges are. According to the rules of all of ancient Rome, Masseria shouldn't have been able to defend herself, and she was a victim of circumstances, thus she was allowed to be able to. Valerius Maximus writes that because she had been accused, Masseria of Sentinum defended her own cause before a great crowd at the court convened Praetor Lucius Titus, and having used all the techniques and devices of defense not only accurately but also courageously, she was acquitted at the first hearing and almost unanimously. So because she was concealed by a manly spirit in the guise of a woman, they call her androgynous. Nice. Love a poet, but their content is too happy for you? Consider banishment. Worked like a charm in the case of Ovid's exile. In December of 2017, similar to the writer and poet Dante, Rome's council unanimously approved a motion to repair the serious wrong suffered by Ovid, thought as one of the 3 canonical poets of Latin literature, by finally ending his exile. So, why exiled? Well, we have 3 factors at play. Ovid's sensual poetry was considered offensive, his attitude to the Emperor Augustus was too disrespectful, and he may have been involved in an unspecified plot or scandal. He was friends with a bunch of the members of the failed coup against Augustus in 6 AD, so it was believed he knew it was going to happen but didn't tell anyone, aka conspiracy. Rumors were also implied that he helped Julia in her many affairs, which scandalized Roman society and pissed off her hubby. And Ovid may have had an affair with the emperor's granddaughter. All we know is that in 8 AD, Ovid is booted out of Rome on personal orders of Augustus without due process. It was a big ol' scandal in the empire, but who's gonna say anything? We could go to Ovid for answers on what happened, but exile was brutal for him. He had to leave his wife and kids, so all he'd ever say, it was the result of a verse and a mistake. When Augustus died, the Pope and his family had real hopes under the order of banishment that it would be lifted. Unfortunately, the successor, Tiberius, was a cruel man and continued to forbid the poet's return. He died of unknown reasons in 17 or 18 AD. Imagine seeing Triple on the battlefield and it's not because he got conked on the head. The Hoteius trial. It starts with 2 sets of triplets and 2 warring kings. Alba Longa has invaded some Roman territory and the armies of Tullus meet them there, where the armies then discuss how to minimize the bloodshed, only to notice that both sides happen to have brought sets of triplets to the front. It seems divinely sent that the gods had this strange coincidence occur, so it was agreed that the 2 sets of 3 would be the only battlers. The Roman brothers Horatius and the Alban brothers Coratius duke it out to win and end the war. After 2 of his brothers are slayed, the final Roman triplet uses a clever strategy to strike down his opponents and win. The armies go separate ways, and Horatius is rejoiced by his people, but not his sister Horiachia, who is devastated to learn her fiance, one of those 3 triplets from the Albans, has been killed. Horiachia's great grief angers her brother. After all, they were enemies, and they were responsible for the death of her other brothers. He drew his sword and approached his sister saying, "Get lost," and some other stuff, I'm not kidding, and swung his sword through her. Record scratch sound effect. Everyone went from cheering to, "What the hell, dude?" and dragged him before the emperor, who appointed a people's assembly. The assembly's conclusion is what he did was effed in the head, and they can't acquit it. While the executioner's binding him up, Daddy Horatius pulls up and makes an appeal. He thinks his daughter being killed was justifiable. Gee, thanks, Dad. And secondly, he just lost 3 out of 4 kids in one day. I know this is messed up, but this is all I've got left. So they acquitted his son on the admiration for his courage rather than upholding law and justice. And last but definitely not least is the very well-known trial of Jesus. The only issue is the Bible is being so edited and rewritten and redistributed. There are too many different versions of the story to really nail down any real ones. So here is what we know in layman's terms. Passover. Jesus and his disciples, actually his name is Jesus, are in Bethany for the occasion. The first 3 gospels say Jesus' first stop was at the temple complex, where he flips some merchant tables in front of it for selling stuff in a place of prayer like it's a Walmart. Valid. According to the general understanding first proposed by Mark, this event leads directly to the condemnation and death of Jesus. In these first 3 gospels, Jesus and his disciples have Seder, and after dinner they go over on foot to the Mount of Olives, where the famous prayer to God is known to be agony, since Jesus foresees what is to come and he gets 0 response. Where's Dad when you need him? The next day, boom, a mob of Roman auxiliaries snatch Jesus up as Judas betrays him with a smooch. Jesus seals his execution when he responds to the high priest question in court, "Are you the blessed one, the Messiah?" To which Jesus goes, "Heck yeah, dude, I'm the son of come in glory when God's kingdom is established to judge all humanity." Evidently, the high priest was hoping Jesus was smart enough not to admit to a literal jury, but alas, the high priest has to declare this a crime of blasphemy and condemns Jesus for inciting Roman rebellion. There are other contributing factors outside of angry Roman leaders. In Gospel, he's charged for not telling the Jews to pay taxes to Rome. In John's Gospel, condemned because of the growing crowds over his raising of Lazarus. In all 4 Gospels, Pilate is portrayed as reluctant to execute Jesus. He attempts to avoid the decision by offering to release another prisoner, Barabbas, and through a sop over the now now anti-mob by letting them decide. No matter, the crowd cries, "Give us Barabbas," and Jesus is condemned to death for rebellion against Rome, who then crucify him.
Number 10. We're making a video about mysteries from ancient Rome, and you think I'm not going to talk about Pompey's own Villa of Mysteries? You balking, mate, you balking! The Villa of Mysteries was discovered back in 1909 after being buried at Pompeii. One of the more mysterious finds was a wall fresco that depicts what could be a play or wedding, or maybe an initiation ceremony to an ancient Roman cult known as the Cult of Dionysus. We don't really know anything about what this cult actually did. They were obviously very good at keeping things under wraps. What happens in the cult stays in the cult. Or however that saying goes, I don't really remember. No one was allowed to know what happened in their initiation, rituals, or really anything. I mean, they weren't even allowed to write it down. But if that was the case, why was someone allowed to paint it on a wall? Make it make sense, bro. Make it make sense. Number 9. Family traits. I think this one is kind of really interesting. There is a village in western China where the people who all live here, meaning their families are all historically from here, have blue eyes and blonde hair. While not exactly uncommon, I guess, the sheer amount of people specifically from here that have these particular traits that are different from the black hair and dark eye color of most people in China suggests that everyone who is native to this area may actually be descended from an ancient Roman legion. I have the blood of a legionnaire flowing through these veins! That'd be so cool. In 53 BC, Marcus Crassus lost pretty badly in a fight in what is modern-day Afghanistan. It's believed that the Roman soldiers that survived traveled as mercenaries, just trying to make a few bucks, and they apparently wandered as far as this village in western China. DNA tests on the villagers of this area actually do show that they are 50% Caucasian, which is super interesting, but we don't know for sure if it was these traveling for sale legionnaires that were the cause. And maybe I'm just a silly goose, but I don't even know how we would be able to find that out with some kind of archaeological evidence. Number 8. Misleading. In 2010, we discovered a coffin in the city of Gabi. A coffin made of lead. It was also, interestingly enough, in the shape of a burrito, giving it the nickname Lead Burrito. You won't be seeing me going into Chipotle to ask for that one. Yes, I'll take one lead burrito, extra deceased Roman inside, please and thank you. No. The University of Michigan, the ones who led the expedition that found the coffin, said that lead coffins like this are extremely rare. But on top of that, this one specifically is incredibly heavy, like 1,000 pounds, letting us know exactly how expensive it must have been. The mysterious part comes to play when we realize we have absolutely no clue whatsoever who the adult man inside this coffin is. We know he was around at the time of Nero, but there is no evidence inside this burrito about the life this man lived. No extra toppings in this burrito, just lead and meat. Yum. Number 7. The 9th Legion. In ancient Rome, there was a legion that was known to be the best of the best the Romans had to offer. It was known as the 9th Legion. Being the best of the best came with being put into the harshest of areas to fix Rome's problems. So these boys in red were sent to England, past Hadrian's Wall, where they would fight against the Picts. But then, they were just never heard from again, ever. Now, the obvious answer here is that they got absolutely demolished by the Picts. The last thing we heard was from the year 108, and we know that the Legion had a pretty brutal surprise attack in Caledonia due to some Roman guards falling asleep on the job, which doesn't really seem like best of the best behavior now, does it? What makes this whole thing really weird is that in 121, there are some bricks that have the seal of the 9th Legion on them, which is about 13 years after their last mention. And on top of that, there is an officer from that legion who shows up as the governor of Arabia in 142. I think these could have just been survivors who were taken out of England after the best of the best went bust. But who knows? Not me. Number 6. Locusta the Poisoner. Nero, you little rascal you. Emperor Nero was known as one of the worst, and he was also known for having a few people, de-lifed. What better way to do that than with poison? The chemist Locusta was the one who became his poison expert, but she's also kind of unfairly known as the world's first serial de-lifer because of that. Kind of unfairly because it could be completely true. We just have no idea. We know from historians at the time that Nero and even his mother liked Lacosta so much that he actually helped set her up with a school dedicated to creating new poisons and all kinds of research surrounding poison. But we don't actually have any of that research. There is no proof of any of it. But she was executed by the guy who took on Nero's job after he was gone, and I can't help but think there is a decent reason for that. Maybe because of all the people she poisoned and helped poison? We will never know. Probably. I mean, we could. I don't know.
Number 5, loincloths. Going back to ancient Roman and Egyptian times, there we go, 2 for 1. The loincloth was of course used by all. Either that or you would just be naked. I found this neat step-by-step on how to make your own loincloth, and I tried it, and it's way more complicated than I could have ever imagined, okay? We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence because these linens barely made it through a decade, obviously. There's not a lot of bones in them that would hang out over these thousands of years. But ancient Romans would often use leather to make underwear. Can you imagine that? Hot goat skin wrapped around your waist in the sun? Oh, I need baby powder just thinking about it right now. We still use leather today when it comes to undergarments and, you know, zippers and stuff, but that's for another video. We'll get to that another time. Number 4, cesspools. Hey, here's a note. If you're gonna make a massive castle, you need to know where not to build certain rooms, in case you're building a castle. Anyone watching? Like say over a cesspool, as an example. Yeah, don't build anything heavy over here, or else let's talk about it. Cesspools were often placed under floors, which makes sense because, you know, gravity and life and stuff. But you need to make sure those floors are supportive enough, period. That's it. Or else, this will happen. Back in 1183, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had a dinner in the palace of Erfurt. But in the main floor of the main hall broke open, resulting in a bunch of dinner guests falling through said floor, with even a few drowning again in said cesspool. Yeah, it's a horrible way to go. And then again, in 1326 in England, Richard the Raker had just sat down. The guy hasn't even started his meal yet, and then again the floor beneath him broke and he fell through and drowned in a cesspool. That's like the worst way to drown too. I'd say chamber pots were safer, but when it comes to waste, out of sight, out of mind. Sadly, just get that away from me. Just downhill, get it out, or else we'll drown in it, probably. Number 3, Roman shampoo. Okay, when my hair grew out over the pandemic, I had a panic attack. I don't know what the f to do. I had a huge wake-up call. I've never had long hair before. I didn't know what to use in this mop. I still don't. Clearly, evidently, all I had growing up was the classic 4-in-1 shampoo for guys. That wasn't working out at all. That sucked. I needed some curl cream, okay? Separate jars of items, not just a 5-in-1 with mouthwash on your head. Those aren't good. Those don't do anyone any good. But the ancient Romans, they didn't have Head and Shoulders back then. What did they do? Well, sometimes nothing. They would dip their hair in cold water, and at public bathhouses also, very public, then they would rub and scrape away oils. Lime water was also used to wash your hair, but that was just as useful as lime wire. Sometimes Europeans wouldn't even use water at all to clean their head. They would rub their head with bran, like just a loose bran, before bed, and then they'd brush it out with a comb in the morning. Yeah, bran. I used dog shampoo once by accident. I thought that was bad. Bran? Be so itchy, I wouldn't sleep a wink. Number 2, ancient socks. Somebody got me socks over the holidays as a gift, and let me tell you, last year, I became a man. I was like, thank you, I actually love this. This is now the best gift of my life. Socks and lip balm, that's it. I don't want a PlayStation, get lost. Socks in ancient Greece, first of all, they weren't, you know, the ankle socks. There weren't Vans skateboarding socks. There weren't the weird grippy ones that kids have. Where were those growing up, first of all? Not even close. Socks came around in the 8th century BC, and it was made fresh from animal hairs. This led to Romans tying animal skins around their feet, and then, you know, tying it more and more and more and higher. Anything to keep it there. Now cut to the 2nd century AD in ancient Rome, the sock game finally got real. Romans began using fabrics instead of animal skins. It was now softer, it was lighter, and then later in the 5th century, socks were worn only by the most holy, which is kind of ironic because socks have holes in them. You get the joke, there it is. Socks were associated with the church. They were considered a symbol of purity. Socks would go all the way up your leg back then. Like I said, a little different than the New Balance ankle socks we got today. A little less holy. Finally, number 1, public bathhouse. This last one, okay, we haven't moved on from this at all. That's why I wanted to finish this list. Nice little fresh, fun reminder from Taylor McWaters. Here we go. We still bathe together, a lot. We go to water parks and we swim around in pools filled with pee. Ancient Roman bathhouses were the older, slightly yuckier versions of water parks. They would literally spread intestinal parasites. They were actually way worse. And these massive rooms with giant pools just lie disease. Nude, there were dicks, and everyone was sweaty, and it was all tight, and there was no filtration system. It was like an indoor hot tub without the pumps or the salts. It was gross. The Romans were literally figuring out sewage systems at the same time, which I of course mentioned earlier, but they were also the first to create heated public baths. Yeah, my above ground pool wasn't heated, but the ancient Romans, they had heated pools. Great, I gotta send an email to my dad this afternoon. Now I'm pissed. The Archaeology and Anthropology department at Cambridge discovered that Romans brought lots of parasites to Europe. Yeah, the fossilized feces showed that these heated, relaxing, rejuvenating bathhouses nearby were all butt. Yeah, they were horrible. They were just spreading hot disease, coming in hot. I don't mean to undermine the ancient Romans. To be fair, they also brought with them lice and fleas. Ayo, this one for the road.
Number 10 in the countdown. The Christian view of women in ancient Roman society came in and, like the religion itself, quashed the pagan beliefs preceding them. Pagan times in Rome weren't a merry old good time for women, don't get me wrong, but they had more rights and respect when there was a whole pantheon of women gods whose tempers were to be revered and feared by every Roman man. But then they convert and answer to one god who was depicted as a soul man, making it, pun intended, a man's world. In the 4th century AD, the Andrew Tate of ancient Rome, St. Jerome, set the standard on how you should perceive and treat women around you. If your wife has a bad temper, or if she's stupid, or if she has a birthmark, or if she's haughty, or if she has a foul breath, you'll only learn these things after marriage. You always have to tell her how beautiful she looks. If you so much as look at another woman, she feels rejected. You have to bow down before her and call her my lady, and you mustn't forget her birthday. It's worse if she's pretty than if she's ugly, because then you have to constantly be on your guard. Honestly, try and tell me you can't picture some old Roman bald dude in a toga, like white beard, one of those stupid teak tables, wearing the oversized podcast headphones, saying that exact tirade while like Joe Rogan is sitting across from nodding like, yeah man, yeah, that's what's up. Hey dude, kinda makes sense that you're only gonna find out about her personality after you married her, when y'all don't even know each other when you get married and you bought her at a bride auction like she's a cow for your farm. So, according to St. Jerome, it was better to be alone with God than in the company of a woman. Guess God is a woman, because he was found in bed having an affair with a married one. Oopsies, hypocrite. Do you want to learn more about hypocrisy in the past? Because there's a ton of it. Subscribe to The Hive to see our regularly released history videos. Alrighty, that was a beautiful segue into number 9, the discussion of how women in ancient Rome could be worshipped but never equal. As stated, while Roman society may have been dominated by men, their original godly pantheon was anything but. They bowed to powerful women, begging for mercy or pleasure from their female goddesses. Part of the appeal of Christianity was bowing to a woman no longer. They finally became obsolete, powerless. But they were anything but powerless in the era of Roman paganism. Of the 3 supreme deities worshipped by ancient Romans, only one, Jupiter, the king of gods, was male. The other 2 were Juno, the chief goddess and protectress of the empire, and Minerva, Jupiter's daughter, the goddess of wisdom and war. The Vestal Virgins, aka priestesses of Vesta, were ranked among the city's most important residents, having been appointed to this role before puberty, remaining chaste for the next 30 years of their lives. These 6 virginal women held sacred duties like preserving the hearth fire, and Vesta's temple, as it was believed if the fire died, so would Rome. That's a pretty serious job. They also had the most important duties in the kingdom, such as safeguarding the wills of the wealthiest and most prominent Romans, such as Julius Caesar himself, because women were more trustworthy than men, but they weren't to be trusted. Okay, anyway, the priestesses' religious significance gave them unusual power and influence, and they occasionally used it, as when they intervened to save the young Caesar from the dictator Sulla. This worship of women and deifying them into earthly roles such as the Vestals had been the saving grace of women's rights in the horrifically male-centric Roman society. Unfortunately, as said, it was swept away in the name of man. Okay, a break from sad lady facts. For number 8, let's cover warrior women. Yeah, now that's more like it. So, from the northernmost tip of the border with Asia, plenty of ancient European armies were happy to welcome women into their ranks. But historians always agree upon one exception where the army and navy were almost 99.9% men. Can you guess who it is from the title of the video? Women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have seen their fair share of female combatants, as well as their own women on the home front. Professor Valentine J. Belfiglio shared that Roman women were capable of close combat as well. Not only were they frequent competitors in gladiatorial shows, but they, like the women of the clans fighting against the invading Romans, were known to take up arms in warfare, albeit in a non-official, unsanctioned capacity. History tells of a few of these women, such as Cloelia, who in 506 BCE freed herself and 20 others from the Etruscan camp and swam them home through enemy spears. For her courage, the Romans erected a bronze equestrian statue with the heroine seated upon it. Belfiglio notes, on the highest point, a along the sacred way. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal was invading, women and men inhabitants fought valiantly, and they burned his siege engines together. Hannibal would later face and lose to the honored Busa, who aided Roman fugitives from his war regime. So, in summary, women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have battled against and sometimes besides women despite that. The name game! It's number 7 in the countdown. Women, like a lazy boy chair, an ice maker, or owning a cat, were possessions in ancient Rome. And so, like the college roommate who complained if you moved their toaster 2 inches to the left, they put their name on it. Not in a label maker fashion, more so in a recycle fashion. From the moment of their birth, women were viewed under male authority. Therefore, the name of a baby girl would be close to her father's. For example, Claudius may have a daughter named Claudia. Augustus becomes Augusta. Constantine, Constantina. Okay, so maybe the rule was just whatever the last letter was, swap it to an A. Ironically, this is why a lot of women's names end with an sound. Talk about making historical waves, seeing as our society still inherently perceives names with that ending as sounding feminine. As the empire grew older, women in the ancient Rome were granted more freedom, often by sheer number of children they bore. 3 children could allow a woman to become independent. Independence meant no more naming your kids after their dad, which isn't fair anyways because I'm sorry, but who carried this kid for 12 months and then had to push it out? Thus, daughters started being named after goddesses, their mothers, their aunts, and plants. Anyways, number 6, once you were old enough for baby time, you were married off, and when that happened, you donned a stola. In my recent video, the top 10 messed up marriage traditions in ancient Rome, I explained the Roman marriage ceremony and also the garb worn. The flamium was an egg yolk yellow veil worn by brides that they would lift from their face and hair in preparations for vows, to instead fall down on their shoulders and biceps. This placement of the veil signifies her donning the stola. The stola was a type of long overlay. Sometimes it was in the form of a dress itself, but oftentimes it was an additional soft and light drape of material. It was worn by married and respectable women and was also associated with modesty. For those who could afford it, a stola with decorations around its neckline was available. This trim could be patterns, embroidery, beads, and motifs. When initially introduced, the stola was a preserve for the upper-class patrician women in the early republic. But over time, the right and then the absolute expectation to wear it extended to the lower-class women. The palla, a rectangular shawl, was also worn over it as a cloak and draped over the left shoulder. Any women who were convicted of adultery or were working girls or actresses were forbidden to wear a stola in public.